Okay, well, I'm Daniel Sanderson, and I want to welcome everybody back to another episode. And this is my really, really good friend.
Hi, Keynes, and welcome to Talk Through the Loop. On today's episode, we are going to be discussing Taiwan and obviously the geopolitical issues surrounding that. Well, I can't call them a country, but that entity that may or may not be a part of China. And one of the things that's interesting in me right now, specifically with Taiwan, is what's happening in another area of the globe, and that's between Russia and Ukraine. And how does China perceive the West's reaction to supporting Ukraine, and how might that influence their decisions on their behavior towards Taiwan? What do you think, Dan?
Right. Well, I think the starting point is you have to look at it and say Russia should be recognized by history as being the aggressor. I think that's a matter and state of fact. They were the aggressor in that Ukrainian situation. How would aggression towards Taiwan be taken? Well, I think in a very Western way. So the West would, I would think, come to defense in a very similar way to Taiwan as being a sovereign state. And I think it's the wish and the hope of modernity and our global politic that we no longer do that we've somehow grown out of that, and that we respect nations and we don't invade them anymore. So I don't know. I think the wisdom that I kind of meditate in, I guess, would be that we have never in human history been able to pull off such a stunt. I mean, in terms of everybody getting along. And I understand in an uphill climb of prosperity that there's an incentive, natural incentive for prospering and better times. But as we kind of hit that apex and start to head back down towards Earth, what is the reality of the way humans interact? And are we out of the woodwork with conflict and wars, nationalism, protecting, hoarding resources? I think we're in for some troubled times, and I don't know if the Western ideals of protecting nations, in particular, say the United States as being a world police to defend the Western values, is something that we are prepared to pay the price for. So
Right. Yeah, from my perspective, I see it in like a three-prong kind of view. We have the media that has the stomach for conflict. Just if you watch, the headlines, especially in the last few weeks with one of their congresswomen going to the country, the rhetoric in the media is quite amped up. And then you have the perspective of China. China, this is my own subjective opinion, doesn't have the stomach for an invasion right now with Taiwan, considering their economic situation is a bit turbulent. And I think if you look at, the history of China, they tend to steer away from conflicts. They tend to be more pragmatic and look at the long-term implications of their decisions. So I don't think China really has the stomach. They want to have Taiwan in their sphere of control. And then there's the third prong, which is the United States, and they don't have the stomach either. I I am of the view that if I'm wrong about China and China gets aggressive with Taiwan, the United States will stand by and let it happen. And the geopolitics that separate Taiwan from Ukraine is there's an ocean that separates a supply chain to support Taiwan. Whereas, the western side of Ukraine is surrounded by NATO and supply lines. So it would be very difficult to for NATO or Western powers, and specifically the United States, to give that same support to Taiwan. It, especially from an economic perspective, sanctions and whatnot. It's a different story. Really, their only card is military action, and the States doesn't have the stomach to go against another nuclear power. It just will never happen. I'm going to go out on a limb and say, really, the political landscape of the United States right now makes them, with their own ideals and backing them up, they're a bit chicken shit on it now.
Both sides, I guess, basically what you've said, both sides are kind of chicken shit, really, when it comes to it.
Yeah, I think part of it is obviously MAD, which is mutually assured destruction. I think that's been part, we've discussed this, outside of this show, the American prax. Part of the American prax has been mutually assured destruction. That's what's made it so successful. There's one part, the American power projection. They have carrier fleets all across the planet, land military bases all across the planet. That's part of their power projection. But the other part is it's mutually assured destruction.
Yeah.
So I think that's the biggest part where, I don't think China, from its, historic standpoint, wants a war, really. And at this point, they've kind of moved into the capitalist realm and the profit realm. And they also know that they are playing, that risky game. They are the new Soviet Union, right? So Russia being aggressive now is a magnitude lower than China being aggressive, because they are essentially a superpower now.
Yeah.
We were between the late 80s and the early 2000s, the United States was a hyperpower. But I don't think that title is deserved anymore, considering I know you love this word, GDP. China's right up there in gross domestic product. Their land military exceeds the United States military. They lack on sea and they lack in air, but they're catching up. So, yeah, that's my opinion. Now, if China invades, which I then would be wrong in my theory, and the United States responds, again, I would be wrong in anticipating or predicting how all that would play out. That's the end of the world. China, they're unsure if it's a couple hundred nuclear warheads, but even at a couple hundred, that's enough to, push us to the tipping points we're already at with climate change anyways. Mm-hmm. It might cool down the planet, actually. That sounds callous, but anyways, that's the end. Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Maybe the best solution for a invasive species, right? That's God's fumigation, right? It's just like, but we come up with we fumigate ourselves. Wow. We are the chosen ones, that's for sure. Why am I laughing? It's horrific, but it's very ironic. That's why it's it's like Thanos's glove, except for snapping twice, I guess. Like just boom, boom, just everybody's gone. I
Guardians of the Galaxy again, Daniel.
yeah, I know.
We're gonna have to dedicate a whole episode
Yeah, yeah.
for Marvel, obviously, because I think you have a secret passion there that
For
is
Marvel, yeah.
yet to be explained.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know what it is. Why is it that I'm preoccupied with the Thanos Club, right?
Daniel, let me ask you a question. With China and its rise, and obviously, if we look at the auxiliary situation of Taiwan, is this frightening to you?
Not yet because it doesn't it we've been um corralled and we've been um agreeing to a regulation of through economics and through business and through commerce. So to me, that's still paramount. And if there is a modernity that has pushed um, the warlike times of our past of dominating countries and this type of thing, taking over countries, I think I'm not giving up on commerce in the markets yet, even if capitalism is coming to an end, like Keynes would say. I think there's I could just simply say I think there's still hope. Um, until I see, but that's why I think Russia was so surprising for me. And I know it's everybody would say that it was the writing was on the walls for many years. And, I mean, that's always easy to say after the fact, but I think still deep down, when I realized that there was in our generation an actual invasion war like that, not a response to terrorism, right? I mean, I'm trying to single out, the Gulf Wars and stuff, but or conflicts in Afghanistan and fighting terrorists and hunting them and all this kind of stuff. Um, I think it's different. Russia felt different. It felt like something out of a history book. You're doing what? You're invading a country? You're like, what's going on here? Like, this is like some sort of like return to, a World War II move. That's what it feels like, right? It feels like, oh, we're tired of this. We're going to now just take that country and see what happens. And that is still very shocking to me to realize that has happened. I think it's shocking.
Yes. From a short-term historical perspective, yeah, for me as well. They said, despite Ukraine separating from the Soviet Union, and a lot of our media sources like to depict countries in that eastern area as not third world, but not quite first world. They are a developed nation, right? And to see one developed nation attack another developed nation is shocking for our generation because it hasn't occurred in our lifetimes. But on a long-term historical perspective, this American praxis, I like to call it, and anybody listening, Wikipedia, the Roman prax, to get an understanding on that terminology. From a long-term perspective, it was just a blip, World War II to now. It's just a blip. And, if we go 500 years, let's say over the next few decades, the world devolves into anarchy. And as you said, I don't hope that happens. And I have hope that, we can innovate our way out as a species from violence. But let's say we do devolve into anarchy and somehow our species survives beyond that anarchy and we're 500 years in the future. They would look at the period, let's say there's 100 years of anarchy or 150 years of anarchy. They would look at the period between World War II and the early 2000s as a small blip. It would be insignificant. It's not like the Roman prax, where it's 1,300 years.
Yeah.
of, global dominance, or at least global dominance in the sphere of Europe and,
The world.
yeah. So it is shocking from my perspective as, a person only of 38 to see this. But if I step back and look at it from a longer term historical perspective, it was only a matter of time. And we are still human, So we still, in our own country, we still see disputes that turn violent, criminality between human beings. So from a global standpoint, if you have different sects, it's only a matter of time. And then there's, I think, one more dynamic, and that's NATO. And this is a dangerous territory for me because I don't want to come off as pro-Russian or pro-NATO, but the undeniable fact is NATO has encroached on Russia's borders. That is an undeniable fact that we have the military complex of the West on the borders of Russia. Russia does not have their military complex in Cuba or Mexico, or Greenland. So I look at it, the big picture like that, and I say, well, it was only a matter of time.
So you're actually even saying that NATO is the aggressor, the silent aggressor here, that forced the hand of Russia to be the invading aggressor.
No doubt, Putin is a dictator. No doubt, he lacks in human rights. But that can also be said of the West. And we can look at the invasions, of the Middle East. We can look at Abu Ghraib and the prison and the torture. We can look at Gitmo. We can look at what happened in Afghanistan. And we can also look at the fact that NATO didn't become stronger by incorporating countries like Estonia, or some other small countries. It was simply a projection of power towards Russia. And if the roles were reversed and a nation was doing that to the United States, you obviously know the United States would be provoked and would probably act out. I'm not saying that, Russian soldiers going into Ukraine and attacking civilians is a good thing, because that occurs in wars. I'm not saying either side is right in the moment of war, or maybe the fog of war. But the West is equally responsible for this. Strategically, if we look at Estonia and the countries around there, from a global perspective, they're insignificant, and they're just a provocation. If the West was truly, and I don't suspect there's a cabal group out there that says we're going to surround Russia. I think it's an evolution through time and mismanagement of having the greater amount of resources. But at the end of the day, they encapsulated more and more countries until they were on the Russian Federation's border. And Putin has one argument, and that's sovereign security. He has that one argument. And the biggest country on that eastern border is the Ukraine. And they not only are they the largest geographical country, they're one of the greatest grain exporters on the planet.
Yeah.
So they are a resource wealthy nation. So this is a 50% of Western nations doing, just as much as Russia has been provocative as well, with their news media in their own country, probable cyber attacks, espionage, the list can go on. they are equally responsible for walking down this road since the end of the Cold War, and probably perpetuated by Putin's inner circle and Putin himself.
Mm.
I'm not excusing that part of it, but we are responsible as Western nations and NATO as well.
Mm. So do you think that I mean, so in that case, you look at something and it's like Ukraine's kind of the pawn. It's not like Russia has come at the biggest player on the West in the West. I mean, I'm kind of skipping past NATO as a whole, and I'm just saying more orientated at the largest superpower, the United States, and say, no, we're going to go after Russia's not going after the United States. I mean, this seems a little bit silly, but it's a little bit of a thought experiment here. It's that they're playing a game. They're not directly fighting, the United States in a land battle. I mean, they may be mounting attacks in terms of trying to disrupt the American political process, which, I don't know. What do you think about that?
It's definitely the equivalent of the proxy wars from the 50s and 60s, and that would be Korea and Vietnam. It's definitely on that level, except the roles have reversed. So Russia is putting troops, in a foreign country, and the West is supporting that foreign country. Whereas in the 50s and 60s, the Soviet Union, as my understanding goes, was more a financial supportive role, and the West was putting soldiers in the country. That is the definition of a proxy war. So this is definitely a proxy war, and it is a power position played by Putin at this point.
Yeah, and you almost wonder if that's kind of the last sort of stand, because I mean, I'm trying to put myself in Putin's perspective, and the easy one to throw at Putin is that it's all for his cronies and his rich lifestyles and stuff. Okay, sure, fair enough, but if there is no foundational Russian strong economy or relatively strong economy to keep Russia what it is, and I think it may have felt to Putin like it was his only option to make a move like this. I don't know.
I think the other thing for Putin is to prevent, which has backfired on him, neutral countries like Sweden and Finland joining NATO, which they have now applied, which would a year ago would have been unheard of. They have been neutral and want it to remain neutral and never want it to be drug into I believe it's the 5th article of NATO. You attack one country, you attack us all. So that's essentially backfire. But I think the goal was, okay, this is what's happening to Ukraine. I don't want to see any more Eastern powers, fall into the fold of NATO, or look what could happen. Obviously, I think, and it's very hard, but when you get all your information from the media, but I think Putin might have expected this to be a lot easier. It didn't work out. Probably in the same way that, the United States thought they could go into the Middle East and, use, brute force to get capitulation.
Yeah.
So in a lot of ways, this hasn't worked for Putin. But yeah.
Yeah, it's hard to say. It's really hard to say when we're right in the middle of right in the middle of this. I suspect that it gives a little bit of credence to the idea of a global left-wing conspiracy. Okay, now just hear me out. I'm part of that. I agree. I usually argue from the left, but one of the things that an opposition does is they argue that a lot of the left maneuvers have to do with repositioning and trying to anchor for power. And this has been thrown at the medical profession, the scientific bodies. When the new world order hits, these organizations are going to be the ones left standing because they have the power, right? And that's been one of the real strong complaints by, let's just call them deniers, for to make the conversation a little bit more telling of who I'm trying to describe, right? And I think that I think there is some shuffling going on, and I think there is a redistribution of power that will happen naturally or man-made. And if we look at it from a big picture and we look at what's happening in Ukraine, you can see that entire countries are being used, modernized countries, progressive countries like Ukraine are now being used as pawns. And I don't know about you, but are you getting desensitized to it? I mean, in another 5 years, if there's an ongoing war in Ukraine, are we still as excited as we are right now? And the death toll keeps going. And what are we doing about it? I mean, I could bark my head off, right? I could, yell and scream, but I don't know ultimately if that kind of like bow wowing, is really going to really affect anything.
Well, Daniel, what do you think my dog Marty thinks about it? Marty? He's okay with it.
I think he was calling bullshit. Like, what if he was really listening to it and those were his words were bullshit, and he was like kind of trying to cough, like.
We got 2 minutes left here, but I think he's upset. This is why I should not have my dog during these. I'm going to leave it though. I think the issue is we're already becoming complacent after 4 or 5 months with Ukraine.
Yeah.
So if this were to go on 5 years, in a lot of ways we became complacent with Iraq and Afghanistan to a large degree. It became the norm. And that went on for, Iraq over a decade and 20 years with Afghanistan. So, yeah, I think, to return it back, hopefully, China is looking at this in relation to Taiwan and how they would handle this from a geopolitical perspective and say, you know what, it looks like a fuck cluster over there. I don't want any part of an aggressive stance towards Taiwan. Well, anyways, Daniel, we're out of time again. It's been great, as always. And we'll be back next week. I'm Ty Keynes.
And I'm Daniel Sanderson.